Most people have held a $1 bill hundreds of times. You fold it, spend it, trade it, rarely stopping to look at the face staring back at you. His name is George Washington, but the real Washington is not the one Americans celebrate. There's a hidden history behind that calm, stoic portrait. A history of conspiracies, battlefield betrayals, political experiments, secret correspondence, and decisions that shaped a country that wasn't supposed to survive its first decade. Tonight, we're going much deeper than textbooks or patriotic legends ever dare. We're peeling back every uncomfortable truth, every forgotten episode, and every mystery surrounding the man who became the symbol of American power. This is the dark past of the man on the dollar bill. And once you hear the full story, you'll never look at your money the same way again. Before we begin this journey, I want you to look at something you've seen 1,000 times. A single dollar bill. Slightly wrinkled, passed from hand to hand, sitting quietly in wallets, cash registers, and pockets across the country. Now look closely at the face printed on it. The expression is calm, controlled, almost impossibly composed. But ask yourself this: why would a man who spent his entire life protecting his reputation, even hiding parts of his personal story, be chosen as the permanent symbol of American identity? Why him? Because George Washington's life, when examined honestly, is not the clean and polished tale carved into monuments. It is a story shaped by ambition, contradictions, calculated decisions, moral tension, political pressure, and a lifetime of controlling how the world saw him. Before we begin this journey, I want you to look at something you've seen 1,000 times. A single dollar bill. Slightly wrinkled, passed from hand to hand, sitting quietly in wallets, cash registers, and pockets across the country. Now look closely at the face printed on it. The expression is calm, controlled, almost impossibly composed. But ask yourself this: why would a man who spent his entire life protecting his reputation, even hiding parts of his personal story, be chosen as the permanent symbol of American identity? Why him? Because George Washington's life, when examined honestly, is not the clean and polished tale carved into monuments. It is a story shaped by ambition, contradictions, calculated decisions, moral tension, political pressure, and a lifetime of controlling how the world saw him. Today we're not looking at the myth. We're looking at the man who worked tirelessly to maintain that myth. And the shadows around him tell a story far more complicated, and far more human, than most people realize. Picture this: colonial Virginia in the 1730s. The landscape is wild, unforgiving, and deeply hierarchical. Wealth is land. Power is inherited. And people fall into rigid social ranks that almost never change. Young George Washington grows up watching this system from the outside. His family owns land, yes, but they lack the wealth and influence that define the true Virginian elite. He learns early that reputation is currency, and he doesn't have enough of it. As a teenager, he studies how powerful men walk, speak, sit, negotiate, and command respect. He pays attention to every detail. He learns to listen before speaking. He learns that silence can be a strategy. He learns that the appearance of control is sometimes more important than control itself. Even now, long before the Revolution, long before the presidency, the seeds of the Washington myth are being planted, not by history books but by Washington himself. But the path he chose required stepping into a world that was unforgiving and often dangerous. Imagine Washington at 17, already towering over most of his peers, already cautious with his words, already calculating the impressions he leaves on others. He desperately wants an officer's commission in the British Army. Not because of loyalty to Britain, but because an officer's rank meant status, authority, respect. But here's the problem. To the British elites, Washington is an ambitious colonial, talented, yes, but ultimately beneath them. Sheer determination takes him only so far. Washington wants recognition, but recognition isn't offered freely in this world. And as history shows, he eventually found a way to take it. Would you have survived in a society where status determined almost everything? Comment yes or no. Washington's ambition would eventually propel him forward, but at a cost that followed him for decades. Before he ever became a general, Washington was a surveyor. And surveying in the 18th century wasn't just mapping land. It was mapping opportunity. He rode through forests, crossed rivers, negotiated with settlers, and spent long periods alone in the wilderness, a place where danger was constant and survival required discipline. This work hardened him. It also introduced him to powerful landowners and powerful expectations. He learned that land meant influence. Influence meant networks. Networks meant power. And these connections, built silently along backcountry trails, would later shape some of the most important moments of the revolution. But as Washington's reputation grew, so did the pressures he carried. And the man who would become the father of the country found himself entangled in moral and political conflicts that tested every ideal he claimed to stand for. Mount Vernon, the place most associated with Washington, the home he returned to again and again, and the place that reveals more about him than any battlefield. But Mount Vernon was not simply a calm plantation on a hill. It was a complex operation, demanding constant oversight, discipline, and decisions that weighed heavily on Washington's conscience. Running Mount Vernon required Washington to be strict, precise, and often uncompromising. He monitored the estate like a military operation. Schedules, outputs, ledgers. He believed chaos was the enemy of success. And this mindset would influence every political decision he later made, both good and bad. But the shadows of Mount Vernon would haunt him for the rest of his life. When historians study Washington, they often turn to his private journals and letters, where the carefully controlled public figure disappears. Here, Washington emerges as a man who experienced doubt, confusion, moral struggle, and frustration. A man who questioned whether the ideals of liberty and justice were truly compatible with the world he lived in. And despite the myth of the calm, emotionless statesman, he was deeply affected by criticism, especially when it came from fellow Virginians or political rivals. He feared disorder. He feared instability. He feared the young nation falling apart before it could fully form. These fears shaped his leadership and his legacy. Do you think leaders should be open about their fears or keep them private? I'd like to hear your thought. Yes. And these fears only intensified when war broke out. Washington knew that great expectations can be a burden. Even before he commanded the Continental Army, whispers spread that he was destined for leadership. But destiny is not a gift, it's a weight. And Washington carried that weight everywhere he went. And soon, it would collide with the greatest conflict in American history. Before George Washington became a legend, he was a young man wandering the edges of an empire, an ambitious teenager in a world dominated by European power struggles, failing colonial administrations, deadly epidemics, and families who built their influence through land, marriage, and sometimes exploitation. Washington wasn't born into greatness, just into expectation. His father died when he was 11, a moment that shattered his path and denied him the education his older brothers received. He grew up in a world where land meant everything: wealth, influence, status. And young George wanted all of it. His early diaries reveal a boy who thought obsessively about success, appearance, social rank, and the approval of powerful men. For someone later celebrated as humble, Washington began life wanting nothing more than to climb. But this ambition would pull him into dangerous territory, politically and literally. In 1743, Washington inherited enslaved people and land, a reality rarely highlighted in heroic portrayals. He was 11 years old. Although he later expressed private discomfort with the system, his early life and rise depended heavily on it. He recorded profits, trades, and valuations the way modern investors track stocks. At 16, he ran land surveys that helped wealthy families expand, and in return it elevated him socially. This wasn't evil for the sake of evil, it was the blueprint of the colonial elite. But it reveals a Washington shaped as much by opportunity as by principle. At just 21, Washington was tasked with delivering a message deep into the Ohio River Valley, territory fiercely contested between France and Britain. The mission was dangerous. Frozen rivers, hostile terrain, and tribes caught between colonial powers. Many assume Washington's early military reputation came from genius. In reality, this mission nearly killed him multiple times. He fell into icy waters. He was shot at by an ally. A guide tried to assassinate him. And then, everything exploded. Washington's decisions in the wilderness triggered the first shots of what became the 7 Years' War, a conflict that spread across continents. A young American officer had essentially helped ignite a global crisis. In 1754, Washington built Fort Necessity, a crude circular structure in a low, swampy meadow. Strategically terrible. Militarily reckless. French forces and their native allies surrounded him. The battle lasted hours. Washington's men panicked. Rain ruined gunpowder. Horses bolted. Chaos swallowed the field. When the French offered surrender terms, Washington agreed, but without understanding one crucial detail in the French written document. The text accused him of assassinating a French diplomat, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The word haunted him for years. He denied the meaning, blamed translation issues, and insisted the diplomat died in a legitimate skirmish. But European newspapers painted him as an assassin. Washington didn't just lose a battle. He lost his reputation among European aristocrats. After Fort Necessity, Washington returned to Virginia in humiliation. His ambitions collapsed. His military dreams seemed over. He wrote letters filled with frustration, about British officers who looked down on colonial soldiers, about a system that denied him advancement because he wasn't born into the right family. This resentment would shape the rest of his life. It planted the earliest seeds of independence, even if he didn't realize it yet. Washington didn't rise through military genius. He rose through survival, political, social, financial, and literal. He married Martha Custis in 1759, becoming one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Virginia. The marriage wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a pragmatic alliance in a world where marriage shaped social rank. But with wealth came access, and with access came power. Within a decade, Washington transformed from a frustrated young officer into one of the colony's most influential political figures. He opposed unfair British tax policies, yet openly benefited from the colonial system. He advocated for liberty, while still owning enslaved laborers. He defended rights, yet excluded entire groups from them. This contradiction defines the dark past of Washington more than any single scandal. In 1775, the American colonies stood on the edge of collapse. Protests had turned into gunfire. Towns were divided. The Continental Congress met in confusion. No one wanted to declare independence, yet no one saw a way back to peace. Washington walked into the chamber in a simple military uniform. Not a single word spoken. Just a message. He was ready. Most delegates didn't know much about him. They knew rumors. He fought bravely in the frontier wars, he criticized British officers, he commanded respect in Virginia. But he wasn't the most experienced man in the room. Many had more education, more money, or more influence. So why him? Because everyone else was too political, too ambitious, too feared. Washington seemed safe, stable, predictable. No one realized they had just handed command of the Continental Army to a man who had never led a full army in his life. The army Washington inherited was barely an army at all. Militia members came and went as they pleased. Ammunition was scarce. Training was inconsistent. Some soldiers had no shoes. Others carried hunting rifles instead of military weapons. Washington wrote desperate letters begging for help, powder, uniforms, officers, discipline. But the truth is painful. Most of the Continental Army didn't respect him at first. His accent, his plantation background, even his height made some suspicious. They saw him as aristocratic and out of touch. And his early decisions didn't help. He demanded strict discipline. He executed deserters. He punished officers who questioned orders. He insisted on formality even when soldiers lacked food. But slowly, grudgingly, the army listened. Textbooks rarely show the political warfare behind the military warfare. Washington's letters reveal constant tension with Congress, shortages, disagreements over strategy, arguments about money, accusations of favoritism. Some members even plotted to replace him. They called it the Conway Cabal, a circle of officers and politicians quietly working to undermine his leadership. Washington found out through intercepted letters and loyal informants. Instead of exposing them publicly, he answered with a quiet line in a private message. A wicked and malicious conspiracy. It was enough. The conspirators scattered. Washington's position strengthened. His authority no longer came from his uniform, but from the quiet fear that he knew. December 1777. The American army marched into Valley Forge, not for battle but survival. Nearly 12,000 soldiers built huts in the freezing woods. Supplies barely arrived. Food shortages became routine. Some men boiled leather for broth. Disease spread faster than blankets. The winter at Valley Forge is often framed as tragic heroism, but the truth is far more complex. Washington struggled with indecision, shortages, and internal criticism. Some officers blamed him for every hardship. Others accused him of moving too slowly or refusing bold action. But something changed there. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben drilled the men relentlessly, turning the disorganized militia into a disciplined fighting force. Washington watched silently. He knew he had just gained the one thing the British feared. An army that could fight on equal terms. Washington's diary during this period reveals a man carrying unbearable weight. He worried about mutiny. He worried about bankruptcy. He worried the revolution would die under his command. He rarely mentioned morale in his writings. Instead, he wrote about logistics, numbers, weather patterns, desertions, and political threats. His leadership wasn't built on charisma. It was built on endurance. He outlasted storms. He outlasted bad generals. He outlasted Congress. And gradually, the army began to believe in him. Washington was more than a general. He became one of America's earliest intelligence commanders. The Culper spy ring operated under his direct orders, using invisible ink-coded messages, dead drops, and disguises. Washington authorized tactics that textbooks avoid: interceptions, bribes, forged letters, and psychological manipulation. He understood one thing early: Britain could win a traditional war. America had to win a creative one. Some historians argue Washington's intelligence network did more to win the war than any battle he fought. In 1781, the Battle of Yorktown ended the war, at least symbolically. While Washington led the siege, many forget. It was French naval power that trapped the British. French money that funded the war's final years. French officers who planned many operations. Washington stood at the front of the victory portraits. But behind him were layers of foreign support and countless soldiers whose names never appear in textbooks. He knew it. He never claimed otherwise. But the myth grew anyway. After the war, Washington did something almost unimaginable. He walked away. He surrendered his command, returned his military commission, and went back to Mount Vernon. Kings don't resign. Conquerors don't retire. Victors don't return to private life. But Washington did. The world took notice. Even Britain's King George III said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." This act shaped global history. It proved that the revolution wasn't about replacing one monarch with another. It was a redefinition of power itself. Washington didn't write the Constitution. He didn't give dramatic speeches. But his presence shaped every word written. Delegates argued, debated, clashed, and compromised, but they all agreed on one thing. Only Washington could unite a fractured nation. They designed an office for a man they trusted but also feared. A role balanced between authority and restraint. A position powerful enough to hold the country together, yet limited enough to prevent tyranny. The presidency was created with Washington in mind. When Washington took the oath of office in 1789, he wasn't stepping into a familiar role. There were no executive traditions, no precedents, no roadmap. The Constitution created the idea of a president, but no one knew what the president actually did. Picture this: a country of 13 states, each suspicious of the others. Debt high enough to crush the young republic. Foreign empires watching closely, expecting failure. Cities small, roads muddy, and the government still living out of borrowed buildings. Washington wasn't walking into a powerful job, he was walking into a fragile experiment. Every decision he made would define the next century. Washington knew the nation saw him as flawless, almost mythical. But that image worked against him. Every misstep made political opponents whisper. Every decision felt like walking on thin ice. Even the smallest choices became national debates. Should he shake hands or bow? Should people call him Mr. President, or something grander? Should he stay visible or rule from a distance? He invented everything as he went. And each invention became law, custom, or tradition. He never asked for this responsibility, yet he accepted that history was watching. Washington's presidency became a battleground between two brilliant but hostile men. Alexander Hamilton, who wanted a strong central government. Thomas Jefferson, who feared centralized power more than foreign armies. Washington stood between them, watching their rivalry quietly erode the unity he had fought for. Hamilton attacked Jefferson's philosophy. Jefferson attacked Hamilton's character. Both accused the other of betraying the revolution. Washington trusted Hamilton more, especially on financial matters, but it came at a cost. Jefferson's supporters turned their anger toward Washington himself. The man who had united the colonies now watched political factions tear the country apart. America was drowning in war debt. Other nations predicted collapse. Hamilton proposed a bold plan: consolidate state debts, create a national bank, stabilize credit, strengthen federal authority. Washington approved it, and that decision nearly split the country. Southern states accused him of favoring Northern bankers. Newspapers, often secretly run by Jefferson's allies, called Washington a monarch, a tyrant, even a betrayer of the Revolution. Imagine fighting for 8 years for independence, only to be called a king on the front page. Washington rarely responded publicly but privately. He wrote that these attacks wounded him deeper than any wound from battle. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania exploded. Farmers violently resisted a federal tax on distilled spirits, a tax Hamilton designed to stabilize the treasury. They burned tax collectors' homes, threatened federal officers, and carved out an area lawmakers could not control. To Washington, it wasn't about whiskey. It was about whether the federal government had any authority at all. He made a decision that shocked the nation. For the first and only time, a sitting U.S. president personally led troops into the field. Not as a symbol, not as a parade, but as an active commander. Washington put on his uniform and rode at the head of 13,000 soldiers toward the rebellion. The rebels scattered before he arrived. There was no major battle, no dramatic showdown. But the message spread across oceans. The United States government could enforce its laws. European monarchies had expected chaos. Instead, they saw discipline, and a president who combined civilian leadership with military authority, yet stepped back once the crisis ended. Once again, Washington refused to become the tyrant some may see, accused him of being. As political parties hardened, Washington found himself targeted in ways the mythology of his youth had never prepared him for. Newspapers accused him of corruption. Pamphlets mocked his voice, his age, even his marriage. Opponents claimed he secretly wanted a monarchy. Some attacks were cruel, even personal. He once wrote, "The arrows of malevolence have wounded me in the deepest recesses of my soul." He had sacrificed his youth, his health, his fortune, and still he was portrayed as a danger to liberty. Imagine surviving war, only to be attacked by the people you fought for. As France spiraled into revolution and war, America became trapped between two global powers, Britain and France. Both demanded American loyalty. Both punished neutrality. Washington believed involvement would destroy the fragile republic. So he issued the Neutrality Proclamation. Jefferson's supporters accused him of supporting monarchies. Hamilton's supporters accused Jefferson of promoting chaos. Once again, Washington stood alone, the only man trying to prevent his country from being dragged into global war before it could stand on its own feet. After years of tension, criticism, and exhausting national disputes, Washington decided he would not serve a third term. His farewell address wasn't a speech, it was a warning. He cautioned against political parties, foreign alliances, regional divisions, emotional politics, leaders who valued ambition over unity. It was less a goodbye and more a prediction of future American struggles. And he was right. Every warning he gave has echoed in the centuries since. When Washington left office, he hoped to return to anonymity. But he didn't return as a farmer. He returned as a national monument still alive, a legend walking through his own halls. Visitors traveled hours just to watch him eat dinner. Strangers followed him across his fields. Politicians sent letters asking for endorsements he refused to give. Even in retirement, he remained trapped by the very image he tried to escape. And behind that dignified image were truths he rarely spoke aloud. Regrets, failures, debts, and personal burdens he carried alone. Mount Vernon was beautiful, but it was also collapsing financially. Washington's letters from this period reveal a constant struggle with costs, repairs, harvest failures, and unreliable tenants. He borrowed money often, even during his presidency. The illusion of great wealth masked the reality of constant debt. To the public he was the ultimate symbol of honor. Privately he was fighting to keep his estate from falling apart. The deepest, most controversial part of Washington's legacy lies here. His complicated relationship with slavery. He owned over 100 enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. He relied on their labor to keep the estate running. He also expressed discomfort with the institution and privately supported gradual abolition. His will eventually freed many, but not all, of the people he held in bondage. This contradiction sits at the heart of his dark past. A man fighting for liberty while upholding a system that denied it. History is not clean. Washington was not simple. And this part of his story cannot be ignored. As tensions with France escalated in 1798, President John Adams feared a full-scale invasion. Congress revived the army. And who did they ask to lead it? George Washington, old, retired, exhausted, yet still considered the only man capable of preventing chaos. Washington accepted reluctantly. He rebuilt the army on paper, met with officers, and prepared for a war that ever came. It was his last public act of service. On December 12, 1799, Washington rode through freezing rain inspecting fences on his estate. He returned soaked but refused to change clothes or warm himself. By nightfall his throat began to swell. By morning he struggled to speak. Doctors rushed in and applied the medical treatments of the day: bloodletting, blistering agents, and purgatives. Treatments that would be unthinkable today. The illness worsened so quickly that Washington realized the end was near. He made requests calmly. He whispered instructions. He thanked his doctors even as their treatments failed. His final recorded words were simple and accepting. When the news reached the capital, the young United States froze. Church bells rang in every city. Businesses closed. Congress wore mourning badges on their arms. People cried openly in the streets. For the first time, Americans confronted the reality of losing the man who had shaped their national identity. Foreign nations paid tribute. Newspapers printed special editions. Poets and painters memorialized him instantly. His death marked the end of an era, not just of the revolution, but of the one figure who held the fragile Union together through its infancy. After his death, something curious happened. Authors, politicians, and artists began reshaping Washington's story, smoothing over contradictions, erasing conflicts, polishing flaws. The real man slowly disappeared behind a mask of flawless virtue. Children's textbooks turned him into a list of perfect traits. Painters idealized his features. Historians sanitized his conflicts, doubts, and failures. And when the federal government began developing national symbols, it needed a face that represented stability, unity, and continuity. Washington became that. The dollar bill wasn't meant to be glamorous. It wasn't meant to celebrate wealth or power. It was meant to represent the foundation, the starting point, something every American would see daily. Washington's portrait on the $1 bill wasn't about hero worship. It was about reminding the nation of its fragile beginnings. But the portrait chosen, Gilbert Stuart's famous unfinished painting, shows a man serene, composed, almost untouchable. Not the general who doubted himself. Not the president battered by criticism. Not the landowner struggling with finances. Not the man wrestling with moral contradictions. A symbol replaced a person. Washington's dark past isn't a scandal or a crime. It's the complexity behind a man frozen into legend. The ambition he tried to hide. The political battles he couldn't control. The moral contradictions he never resolved. The financial struggles beneath the surface. The fears he confessed only in private letters. The enormous responsibility he carried until his last breath. The man on the dollar bill is a simplified version, a symbol carved out of the real, complicated human being he was. And perhaps that is the real mystery. How a man so full of contradictions became the one figure Americans agreed to trust. The final truth isn't glamorous. Washington did not win every battle. He did not always make the right choices. He was not the flawless hero later generations imagined. But he did something far rarer. He gave up power twice. He refused to become a king. He set limits for himself that no one else demanded. And he walked away from authority when the world expected him to seize it. This may be the single reason the United States survived its birth. The dark past doesn't diminish him. It deepens him. If you want to uncover the hidden stories behind the founding of America, the secrets, the mysteries, and the forgotten moments textbooks leave out, then the next episode is waiting for you. The story there is even stranger than this one.